All right. I think we are officially live in the Facebook group or on the Facebook page. And I'm going to share here. Give me just 1 second to share into the group. It's never as easy as it should be. There we go. Okay. I think we are officially live on Facebook. So welcome everyone to our monthly TBI talks with Dr. Perry Maynard from Integrated Brain Centers. He is located in Denver, Colorado, and they see patients from all over the country who are dealing with post-concussion, post-brain injury symptoms. And so today we're talking about fatigue after brain injury. And I think pretty much anyone with a brain injury can relate to fatigue and just the constant feeling of not having energy. So Perry, where would you like to start with this?
Yeah, I think where we can kind of chat about is kind of like the broad array of different things where fatigue can come from. I think just like I think hopefully portrayed is that head injuries commonly have very similar symptoms between people. So headaches, dizziness, brain fog, fatigue, right? A lot of people have those symptoms, but the mechanism behind it can be very different for each person. So we can kind of start by looking at kind of like how I think about fatigue and how we can look at those different mechanisms. So, I always tell patients we can really try to split it into two kind of groups. One is that we know with head injuries, there's always usually alterations in the high-speed connections, right? So it's kind of like we go from high-speed internet to AOL dial-up, right? It's kind
Right,
of like,
right. That's a good description.
right? Or we know that these networks it becomes like a bad game of telephone. So we know that some pieces of fatigue can be related to inefficiencies in the way the brain is now working, right? Or the signals are just not as quick, which can lead to cognitive fatigue or perception of fatigue, right? Because these are the things where people may say, my fatigue is in my body, or my fatigue is when I move, or my fatigue is more in my brain, and then the question is, especially in the research, is it when you test people, is it reproducible? Do they actually fatigue out, or is it just a perception of fatigue, right? Two very different things. So
Yeah,
there's that kind of one piece where we can look at how the brain injury changes the efficiency of these cognitive networks. And then we can also look at, we know with head injuries, that there becomes issues in our ability to regulate energy within the brain. So within all of our cells or throughout the body, we have what are called mitochondria. And mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell that help to produce ATP. Okay. So think of it kind of like being a fuel efficient Prius getting 40 miles to the gallon versus a gas guzzling truck maybe getting 5 miles to the gallon, right? And you're just very inefficient. So we know after head injuries, our brain's ability to use things like glucose becomes very inefficient. And so we go from being able to burn it maybe very efficiently to not efficiently at all. So we also know that there can be energy crises in the brain as well, right? And so this is important because the way you treat that may be very different than the way you may treat cognitive fatigue. Another piece is too, we know that brain injuries can affect what's called the pituitary gland. So within the brain, we have what's called the pituitary gland, and it's got this little stalk, or what's called the infundibulum, that attaches it to the hypothalamus. So say, here's your hypothalamus, here's your infundibulum, and then here's your pituitary gland down here. And so the problem is that infundibulum goes through kind of a bony part within our skull. And so the problem is that whenever we get a head injury and there's motion, think of it almost like, it's this infundibulum is going through this hole like that, and it shears against, right, what's called that sella turcica, or that bony area, and then it can create damage to that stalk, right? And the problem is that stalk is the highway between your hypothalamus and your pituitary gland. So ultimately, that hypothalamic pituitary stress axis, right, or that HPA stress axis that everyone talks about. And the problem with that is that whole axis controls sex hormones. So estrogen and right, some of the feedback with the ovaries and things like that, and testosterone, it can all be fed into that neuroendocrine system. But even more so, it plays a role in regulation of things that play a role in keeping blood volume, blood pressure, immune regulation, and all these different things. So there's all these different things that have to do with cortisol production and regulation of thyroid function and all endocrine function in general, right? And so there can be disruption in that HPA stress axis secondary to damage to that system, which could lead to fatigue, right? Because if now you have low thyroid, or now the connection between your brain and your adrenals is off, or now your menstrual cycle is completely disrupted because of damage to the brain, right? Or maybe your ability to regulate your kidneys and their ability to regulate blood volume has now led to low blood pressure or dysautonomia, and now you're fatigued from that. So that can be another thing we can look at. So we've talked about the highway connections can become slow, leading to a cognitive fatigue. We've talked about your mitochondria become less efficient in how they use energy. That HPA axis can get messed up. And then another piece can be brain inflammation. So we also know that with brain injuries, that we get changes in the immune system. And changes in the immune system can lead to increases in inflammation within the brain, which can lead to brain fog, which actually in turn can then cause all those other things. So
Right.
they can all build on each other, but it's really key to figure out which seems to be more of the culprit, because, and like we may chat about in a second of how we go about maybe treating some of these things, is the treatment could be very different. This might be why adrenal support may help one concussion and it doesn't do anything for another,
right?
Or why neural therapies help for one person with fatigue versus another, or why some supplement, or maybe why the ketogenic diet helps for one person versus the other. It really comes down to mechanism, and those are, I'd say, probably the most common mechanisms that we see clinically. And if you look at the research, seem to kind of support that can contribute to that fatigue after head injuries.
So Perry, I just want to take a moment and welcome everyone who's watching us. I see there's quite a few of you watching live. If you have any questions, please pop them below in the comments and I'll be monitoring those as best I can, or just simply drop us a note, let us know where you're watching from. So we're talking all about fatigue after brain injury and some of the causes, some of the symptoms. Like I said, I think most everyone can relate to this feeling of fatigue and just how everything is exhausting. And, a lot of people who heard the spoon theory, you wake up and you have 50 spoons and each activity takes an amount of spoons. And when you have no spoons left, like there's nothing you can do except, rest to refuel. And I know for me, just simply getting out of the bed in the morning and brushing my teeth and taking the dog out, that like took half my spoons right there. First thing, right? And I know other people watching can probably relate to that. And like you said, there's different mechanisms, there's different reasons for fatigue, and what helps one person might not necessarily help another person because they've damaged different pathways. Every brain injury is so different. And I think that's what makes it also challenging, right, Perry? So what are, some of the ways you go about helping a patient who has come in and they're dealing with fatigue amongst everything else? What might be some of the treatments that you do for fatigue?
Yeah. So yeah, we'll break down all those examples I chatted about and kind of some different tools. So step one, just like with any patient, is trying to identify mechanisms, right? And that all starts with really, honestly, the history. And I think fatigue, sometimes you can learn a lot from history, right? Does exercise help? Does it make it worse? Is it more body fatigue, mental fatigue? Is it worse in the morning? Is it worse at night, in the afternoon? Do things make it better? Do things make it worse? And those can all give you windows into mechanisms, right? And then really with the exam, we're looking at all of those circuits and saying, how efficient are they? But also sometimes you can see with patients where it's just like everything looks so fatigable, right? And sometimes when you see that with people, you're like, there's something going on here, right? And early on, we really want to look at things like autonomics. So how is the brain regulating heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen, because things like dysautonomia can play a role in fatigue. So early on, we're kind of figuring out all those mechanisms. And then there's a lot that can be looked at from laboratory work. So we can look at all those neuroendocrine things. So thyroid, we can look at estrogen, progesterone, what's called ACTH and aldosterone, right? Some of these things that play a role in regulating things from that pituitary gland. So we can look at those aspects. Looking at blood sugar is a huge thing, right? In someone's blood sugar and insulin. So we kind of cast this wide net and determine what kind of testing we need to do to then figure that out. So let's say we find that it is more maybe related to the brain injury and the way the circuits are not connecting appropriately. So in that aspect, it comes to finding, okay, what are the inefficient things? And what you see a lot of times is one of two things is that I always kind of give my patients this analogy. So you have these reflexive systems, things like gait, things like balance, things like knowing where you are in the world. And you really shouldn't have to cognitively think about them, right? Those are, let's say, those are the chores that the kids should do in the household, right? And then your frontal lobe or your executive brain is dealing with all the more important things like paying the bills, going to work, making sure the mortgage is paid, right? If the kids all of a sudden decide to just not mow the lawn or take the trash out, well, who's got to do it now? The parents. And so now the parents have to start allocating some of their time to doing these chores that their children should maybe be doing. So maybe they start getting more tired, things like that. So where I start with improving things like gait, balance, eye movement, coordination, all of these reflexive things. Because what you find sometimes is that you improve those, and then all of a sudden the energy comes way back online, because now that frontal lobe's like, thank you, I didn't have to spend all this time doing and sorting out balance, right? And an example of where you see that with patients is you have someone, let's say, walk, and they look like they walk relatively normal. And then let's say you have them say every other letter of the alphabet, and all of a sudden they freeze, or they start falling, or their gait starts to break down. And really you can do, this is what's called dual tasking. And you can really do this towards anything. And this is what I'll do in my exam is, I may have someone do a simple motor task and then have them dual task, right? And this should be a reflexive task, right? I shouldn't need much, focus to do this. So I should be able to maybe go through the alphabet and tap my fingers. But what you find sometimes is when their brains are compensating or there's issues in those executive areas, people start to break down, right? And so if someone's balancing and then they start doing math and then they start falling, that's not a good sign that their brain's very efficient in any of those tasks. So what we need to do is try to decouple those things and free up those kind of avenues. So that's the way I kind of look at a lot in a simple standpoint with hierarchies of neuro rehab when it comes to fatigue, is looking at how much are other systems compensating for others, freeing those up, and then trying to separate them or decouple them and say, hey, when you walk, this should be reflexive. You shouldn't be needing to use your frontal lobe to make it happen. And if you have to use your frontal lobe to walk, you're going to be zonked, right? You're going to go through all of your energy just trying to walk, let alone now having bandwidth to go to work, you know? So from
Yeah.
a rehab standpoint, that's kind of a way you can look at it. You know, when you look at mitochondria and improving mitochondrial function, there's a few different ways we can look at it. As we'd say, one, does the person have the substrate for mitochondria to work? It's things like B vitamins, acetyl L-carnitine, right? There's certain enzymes and vitamins that mitochondria just need to function. Iron is another big thing, right? Oxygen. So we want to look at for like iron deficiency or low B vitamins or anemia, things like that, right? But then we want to look at the fuel source for mitochondria. And this is where I think ketogenic diets can come in and really shine, or things like fasting. So like we said, we know when there's breakdown in the mitochondria, either from a head injury or maybe in chronic fatigue patients, they have what's called a Warburg effect, where they have the inability to now produce energy from glucose, but they still have the ability to do it from fats, or what are called ketones. So this is where sometimes we'll use a ketogenic diet, or we'll use things like exogenous ketones, or what are called ketone esters. So we give the mitochondria a totally separate form of fuel. And what you find sometimes is these people all of a sudden start to come alive, right? Because they just weren't getting the appropriate fuel, right? So that's where we can look at dietary approaches. This is where I really like things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy, because the hyperbaric helps to really strengthen the mitochondria and increase blood flow and metabolic efficiency. This is sometimes where we'll use things like what's called NAD or IV NAD, which some people may be aware of, but it can be really, really helpful in jumpstarting that mitochondria to produce energy. This is also where I really like things like exercise and really focusing on rebuilding one's ability to start exercising and moving again, because that helps to rebuild the mitochondria. Right. So that's kind of some simple ways where you can go about that. And there's many other things that we can do for that as well. And then from the hormone piece, that's where then we can look at, okay, maybe it's hormones. And so we work on the thyroid, or we work on the adrenals, or those different things, right? And there's different therapies we can use targeted towards that. So that's the really cool thing, is that we got a lot of tools in our toolbox, right? And it's important that you don't just, not every fatigue patient gets the same thing. Right? You gotta search from that toolbox and say, this tool makes sense for this mechanism. You know, and you see it with patients, where patients roll in, they're like, hey, my friend told me to do this because it cured their fatigue. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but maybe that fit their mechanism. And I'm like,
Right.
I don't think that will have anything to do with yours, but if you want to try it, versus if you can figure out the exact thing, then you can start getting that feedback, versus just everyone gets adrenal support, or everyone gets hyperbaric, or everyone gets, blood sugar support. That may or may not be the necessary thing for them. But that's kind of some few different ways of where we approach those different avenues.
So we've got a comment and a question. Tony said hello from Finland. So welcome,
Hello,
Tony.
very cool.
And Teresa has asked, how do you work on the hypothalamus?
It's a great question. So there's a few different ways we can look at. So there are, right, there's, in the functional medicine world, people a lot of times will use certain adrenal support. So there could be certain herbs that can be used. So things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, that seem to have an ability to regulate things like cortisol out of the hypothalamus. So there's certain herbs you may or may not be able to use. I'll go from top down. So the way we can look at it is some of the different pathways into the hypothalamus. What's really cool is the hypothalamus has huge inputs from the eyes, right? More specifically, non-visual retinal pathways, right? And this makes sense because our hypothalamus is all about sleep-wake cycles. It's all about circadian rhythm. So the light that we are exposed to plays a huge role in modulating the hypothalamus. So this is where I really focus with patients on trying to get their circadian rhythms back in check. So doing things with different light exposures at different days, using different color lenses to filter out different lights. Honestly, this is where Terry Trink and I have played around, myself and other neurooptometrists, even with things like light therapy. So where you can have different lenses and you look into boxes and do light therapy to work on how you're to kind of stimulate those non-visual pathways in different ways can be very profound on that hypothalamus. So light is one avenue in going after light and how we perceive light, trying to get into a rhythm. So eating at the same time, sleep rhythm, workout rhythm, right? Rhythms are really important for the hypothalamus. And then we can always look at what are all the pathways we know that go into the hypothalamus. So we know that the inner ear has projections into the hypothalamus. We know the frontal lobe has projections into the hypothalamus, the cerebellum, all these different areas. So for that person, we may find that it's projections from the inner ear to the hypothalamus that are damaged. So then we got to do direct rehab for that, or maybe it's the cerebellum into the hypothalamus. So there's some piece that's also kind of customized. That first piece I think would work for most people, and that's where even honestly, you can look at doing things with different, working on temperature regulation, because the hypothalamus has a lot to do with that. So those are some simple kind of ways from a top down or a neuro standpoint. But then that's where we can look at, there's some cool things we can do what are called peptides. So peptides are kind of these short amino acid sequences. And there's different peptides that we can use to stimulate different parts of that hypothalamic pituitary axis. So there's ones that we can do that play a role in growth hormone, or what's called melanocyte stimulating hormone, right? So we can do different things with peptides that can directly affect that hypothalamus. And then, like I said, there's different supplements, things like adaptogenic herbs that can sometimes help to restore rhythms within that system. And then lastly, working on inflammation in the immune system. We know after head injuries, the shifts in the immune system throw off the hypothalamus. So doing things with anti-inflammatories, things like glutathione, can sometimes be helpful in quelling inflammation, which then can help bring the hypothalamus back online. So you can see there's not just one treatment. There can be lots of different treatments, but one of the avenues I'm most excited about right now is light and light therapy around the hypothalamus. I've seen some really cool things with my co-management with like neurooptometrists, especially a lot of people that do a lot of Deborah Zielinski's work. And I've seen some really cool things with changes in the hypothalamus with some of their tools. So that's something, an avenue I'm kind of excited about and been working with a lot lately.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. We'll try and get to them for you guys. So I have a theoretical question that comes up a lot when talking about functional neurology, and people are often hesitant to try it because they're fearful that it's just going to exhaust them and they're not going to be able to do the treatment, and therefore it'll be a waste of money. But I know that there are benefits to, finding that point of exhaustion, right? Like finding that point and working with that. So what advice do you have for people who are maybe a little hesitant because of the whole fatigue situation?
For sure. And that's a great question, a reasonable question, because I think unfortunately traditional concussion rehab has given it a bad rap. Like I'll take traditional vestibular rehab. It's given rehab a huge bad rap because most people are like, I was worse for 6 months until I got better. I mean, one way to think about it, it's maybe a silly way. It's kind of like, well, you can think about the same way of getting a trainer to go to the gym to get in shape, right? There to rehab, there does have to be a piece of pushing, and not always necessarily pushing through fatigue points, right? But with rehab, we do have to kind of push things. But I think if you find yourself a good functional neurologist, and most functional neurologists really, and this is the difference between functional neurology and other professions in rehab, is they pay very close attention to what I said, which are called fatigue points. So, the whole goal of functional neurology is to find unhealthy neural pathways that are causing one's symptoms and find ways of stimulating them at a rate that makes them stronger, but not pushing them too much. So say I'm pushing a pathway in one's brain, and it's related to maybe, let's say, pupil response. Well, that may be where someone's paying attention. Then as soon as that pupil starts getting a little bit bigger, they stop. So we don't wait for a patient to say, I don't feel good. We try to key in on things 10 steps before that. If we weren't to stop, they may become nauseous, or maybe their tremor becomes a little worse, or their dizziness becomes worse. So a good functional neurologist should really be able to keen in on these fatigue points that happen far before you actually get symptomatic, and that's when they stop. No different than a really good personal trainer or a physical therapist is able to rehab a shoulder and push it just enough, but to where they're not wrecked for 3 days afterwards, right? You may be a little sore the next day, but each time you should be progressively getting stronger and stronger. So I think functional neurologists, if they're good, and they should be, is they should be able to look at that fatigue point far before you actually feel it, and then they can stop. And that's really the big difference, where I try with every patient that they leave and their symptoms are better when they leave, right? Versus you see a lot of therapies where it's like, I'm super nauseous and it's been happening for 6 months every time I leave therapy. Like I always tell patients, is like, that may happen. You may feel a little worse here or there. We have to figure out how we can push you. But like, if you're, 3 weeks in and you've left every time feeling terrible, like you can slap me in the face and be like, what are you doing? Because it doesn't need to be that way. So I think knowing that if you find a functional neurologist and it's not happening that way, then find another person. But if you found a good person, then that's what you really should notice should be happening.
Right. Well, Dr. Maynard, thank you so much for being here today and discussing this. Jose did ask if this will be available for replay later. And yes, as soon as we're done being live here, it just takes it a few minutes to generate the replay, and then you'll be able to come back and watch this in its entirety. So thank you for asking that question. But Dr. Maynard, thank you so much for being here today. If anyone is interested in getting in touch with you, you guys always offer a free phone consultation. If anyone has any additional questions, they can reach out to you. They can find you at integratedbraincenters.com. And you and Dr. Shane Stedman both work out of the clinic. So anything else you wanted to add, Dr. Maynard?
No, not really. I think the key is that there's a lot of great people everywhere, and that there are once again that there are answers, and there's more than a lot of people are led on with their condition. So it's just to keep searching, keep looking for the right doctor, get the answers. Don't be scared to press doctors. I tell patients, and even my family, this all the time with doctors, like, they're just people. Like, you're not gonna, if you offend them, then move on to the next one. Be willing to push them to get the answers that you need for you to feel better.
Yes, great advice. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll be back again next month. So be sure to watch this space for our TBI talk again next month. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.